Halo.
It's finished.
No, I think we're just getting started.
It's a game. It's a book. It's a cartoon. And now, it's a live-action, big-budget show for your television.
Watch out for the creepy crawlies!
Just from a cultural impact, it's easy to see how a Halo series could get developed. Most people are familiar with the games, but there's a lot of lore and stories that can get kind of forgotten about. It's not an RPG, so you aren't taking away the player creation aspect. This is a game that's crafted for showing a universe. Giving the rights to a production company to pump out a 9-episode series, it can absolutely work and stay true to the source material. However, what we get was not that.
That must be the Master Chief.
Yes.
Instead, we get a poorly presented show that relies on science fiction tropes of the modern era while occasionally showing you something that might remind you of the game. For some, this kind of works. In fact, all things considered, this show is a success for Paramount Plus. But the sad truth is that Halo 2022, I guess I'm just calling it that now, takes a lot of creative liberties, and none of them really pay off. Now, one thing I learned in college was I enjoyed it when professors gave off their line of work, just so you know that the person talking isn't some pretentious nut trying to look cool. So, I'm going to give a very quick overview of my history with the series. Halo 3 was the first title I ever played, but the first one I owned was Halo 3 ODST, and it left a pretty big impression on me. Since then, I've played every game except 5, since I didn't and still don't own an Xbox One. I've read one of the books, a quarter of this one, and maybe 25 pages of these. This was also several years ago, so don't expect any hardcore analysis from my part. What I'm trying to say is, I'm not the biggest Halo fan in existence. I don't know every book, I still don't know what made this guy important. I am approaching this as a fan of the series that has shaped a lot of my youth. But as a creator, I also understand that adaptations don't have to be word for word. The showrunners of the show made it clear this is a non-canon adaptation that's going to make creative liberties in order to tell a story. Whether or not this helps, we'll just have to see. Before I can really dig into shit I can't stand,
Oh my god.
I want to go over some things I did enjoy about this show. This is a very large production with hundreds of people involved, and there are things that had effort put into them. As I mentioned, the production design can really shine in a lot of spots. In most cases, the look of both the UNSC and Covenant forces look really great. The capital ships are 1-to-1, High Charity is fucking perfect, even if it's not used very much. The Marines have very good looking gear, and the weapons feel like they're ripped right from the games. Looks fantastic. I also like the character of Soren a lot. I think having a member of the Spartan program realize how fucked up it is and then running away to become a pirate, it kind of sounds like someone's overpowered and silly OC. But for the show, it serves as a good contrast to Master Chief and his diversions into becoming more human, though he still serves the UNSC. In a way, it's a good way of showing one of the lives he could have had.
I'm happy for you.
Well, I could see that.
Oh, and there's also Kai. Kai's great.
You guys got anything heavy?
While Quan is a fairly flawed character that takes up too much time of the show, I think her arc is something that could benefit Halo in a different medium. The Insurrection is something that doesn't get a lot of spotlight in Halo titles, and usually ends up being in bits of lore to flesh out what humanity has been doing in the past 500 years. A young, spirited insurrectionist who's lost everything going after a newly appointed insurrection leader that's clearly a puppet for Oni and wants her family out of the equation, that's a great story. I just don't think it really fits into a show where the focus is a green super soldier guy trying to find a deadly space ring. Okay, what else? Oh, I like how Miranda Keyes is a scientist.
Wow.
In the context of the games, Miranda is just another naval officer. So at the end of Halo 1, when Keyes dies after you smash your glove into his skull, it's like, oh no, the captain is gone. Don't worry, he has a daughter to do all the same things. Now she feels a little bit more in control of her own destiny, and has a purpose to the story. I also saw it as a good combination of her parents' skill. Like, she's similar to Dr. Halsey, specializing in a scientific field to help humanity, doesn't believe in the extreme lengths her mother does. And then of course there's her relation to her father, still kind of being in the UNSC military. It's an interesting concept, and I think it kind of works. And yeah, I think that's it. First things first. Cinematography. You've probably seen that word before. There's a lot that goes into it, and it plays a huge part into making anything that you throw up onto a screen. Some people are really fucking good at it, some not so much. While it's a subject that's typically reserved for big screen movies and Marvel fans talking about how cool their green screen is, it's not really talked about in television. Though with television and streaming shows getting much larger budgets compared to 10 or 20 years ago, the idea of bringing movie-level filmmaking to a smaller screen has gotten only more popular. I think if this were any other show, I probably wouldn't toss this idea around. However, and I am going to say this a lot, this show has an estimate of costing $90 to $200 million to make, and yet, with all this money, Halo has acceptable cinematography at best. Problem number one is the color grading. It's not good. None of it feels special or appropriate for this franchise, or really helps convey a mood that's supposed to be set. Halo's color palette is definitely one that goes through a lot of revisions, depending on who's managing the franchise and what console is being utilized. Halo 1 is super colorful, and has lots of bright green landscapes to complement a much more adventurous story within a sci-fi world. Halo Reach is super bleak, with a much more grounded art style to convey an apocalyptic war scenario of a planet meeting its inevitable fate. And Halo 4 makes sure to land on every epic sci-fi wallpaper search query possible. Personally, since Reach is the one that tried to look the most realistic, and it's the earliest of the main titles in continuity, I feel like that might be the safest one to follow. Instead, this show doesn't try to replicate any of them, which you think might allow for some creative freedom, but what's instead chosen is a very generic look for television. The one thing they chose that's special is these occasional shots where Spartan runs into battle. The camera switches to a first-person perspective, like the games they're imitating. Some of these kind of work at first, but the more they get used, the more it looks like that one Doom movie. Ironically enough, Variety put out an article discussing Halo's long and costly production. In it, there's sort of an infamous quote by the showrunner where they didn't look or talk about the games and wanted to keep everything dialed into the characters in the world. I can understand going this method, since story limitations can be a problem, but the Halo games are some of the first games I can think of where cinematic elements really got utilized in video games. Halo 2, on its own, is full of incredible narrative choices and cinematics that elevate its story to a whole new level, so it's baffling to see a phrase like this. The creators of the show claim to be creating something unique and special in its own right, something that isn't limited by a video game. But the only memorable look they can pull off is a direct emulation of the games they claim to not be limited by. For those living in the States, if you've ever seen a sci-fi show on Fox Television, like Almost Human or The Orville, you'll know what I'm talking about. It doesn't really add anything, nothing looks extra gritty, colors don't stand out, it's all extremely generic, which I find very unfortunate. And speaking of looking at things... Alright, this one I tried, believe me. I fucking tried to hold this one back because it's another creative decision, and while I haven't looked, I'm sure there's 6 million YouTubers that have brought this up already. But I can't not address it. It's not an elephant in the room, it's a fucking Titanosaurus smashing down everything you hold dear. Master Chief is done fucking terribly. If you want to make a Halo show where your main character has internal conflicts right from the get-go and has to sort through them, don't pick Master Chief. Not only does Master Chief take off his helmet in the very first episode, he barely puts the fucking thing on afterwards. He has it on for the majority of the first episode, then comes the big reveal, and it's always off. Holy shit, how do you get it wrong so bad? The thing is, I'm not even against Master Chief having his helmet off, but in order for it to work, it needs to be earned. Go-to example, The Mandalorian. Jin never takes his helmet off, and when he does, it's a hidden shot that lets your imagination loose, or it's a life or death situation where it needs to happen. So when you see it, it's like, oh shit, okay, I guess things are getting very real very quick. They even have a great setup for this kind of shot in the first episode where the reveal happens. If they just pause right at this shot behind his head with the focus being on Quan's reaction, that way you can tell Quan sees that Master Chief isn't a soulless killing machine, but someone who's human, like her. And it also lets the audience imagination wander on who this man is. It's a change in the usual status quo, while remaining true to what makes Halo special. I could see someone comparing the show to the Judge Dredd movie from 1995. This movie faced a very similar backlash, where the character of Dredd, who was famous in the 2000 AD comic for never having his face revealed, had his face being constantly shown.
It's a lie! The evidence has been falsified! It's impossible! I never broke the law! I am the law!
Though that movie is about 90 minutes in length, this show, however, is 7 fucking hours long. And just when you think it's over, it starts right back up again. And the worst part is, I can't even say some shit like they didn't read the source material, because in the 4th episode, a young John is seen flipping a coin with Catherine Halsey to determine whether or not he ends up in the Spartan program. It's a scene pulled right out of Fall of Reach. Whether or not this means they actually read the book, or read the comic book, or watched the animated series, or found a wiki synopsis, I have no clue. Or maybe they pulled a Paul Verhoeven and read 25 pages and went, yeah, this is good enough. Including this scene is like insult to injury. Like, yeah, they know. They fucking know the Halo lore. They know Master Chief's story. And they might even know what Blue Team is. But they don't give a shit. They just need to write an acceptable sci-fi story for people who have a faint idea on what Halo is. Oh, and then there's the actual character writing. With Master Chief having appearances in 6 games, 3 of them being completely different creative teams from the original, there's going to be differences in performances. With Halo 2, Master Chief is awesome and says all the cool stuff with as little words as possible.
I need a weapon.
Just one question. What if you miss?
I won't.
While in Halo 4, Chief is drawn to a much more personal situation as Cortana is destabilizing. So his dialogue is far more emotion-driven, a place in his story where he hasn't really been before.
Give me that chip. The Didact has to be stopped. If you won't do that, I will.
Then in Halo Infinite, they sort of do a blend of both, showing he's developed a more humane side to his persona from the last 2 games.
But this wasn't the mission.
The missions change. They always do.
While retaining those awesome one-liners and bringing things back to a more familiar sense.
You have 1 bullet against an entire army. What can you do on your own?
I told you. It's enough.
So in this show, they went with the route of doing none of that.
Hello. Can I have your attention for a moment, please?
What are you doing? No, I didn't summon you.
This is coming from inside you, Chief.
Go away. AI off.
I'm introducing myself to the rest of the team.
Go. Disappear!
Having Master Chief as a main character is absolutely a challenge from an adaptation standpoint. I can totally picture writers getting told to make the focus on Master Chief and going, oh god, what the fuck do we do? With a video game, a character like Chief is seen mainly as a vehicle between the player and the game. What he looks like underneath that helmet doesn't really matter, because ultimately, it's you, the player. With this show, I think the writers felt like Chief being Chief wasn't good enough. They need a mystery on their hands, and what better way to fuel that than to give the main character internal conflict. With the existence of Halo 4, Chief questioning his orders to make morally right decisions isn't a new thing.
I am ordering you.
To surrender that AI!
No, sir.
Rather than execute the rebel as ordered, he has decided to kill the video feed from his ship.
However, that game took place 5 years after the first 3 games. So Chief has not only saved the galaxy, but the Human Covenant War is over by then. My point is, introducing a morally compromised Master Chief that's questioning his place isn't a bad idea, but it's one that should be saved for later. Oh, and to add insult to injury, there's 2 Spartan characters that are going through this dilemma. Kai-125, a Spartan and Silver team that's led by Master Chief, notices him removing the pellet thing that halts his emotional response, and performs the same procedure. She starts having moments of childlike wonder over very little things, and even starts bonding with the other Marines, which gets an odd response from her fellow compatriots. I thought this idea was creative, but it gets sidelined too much since emotionally compromised Chief is the one that gets focused on. If this show really wanted to have a focus on someone from the Spartan program becoming less of a robotic killing machine and more of a human fighting for the right reasons, Kai should have been the vessel for this plot, not Chief. With a plotline like that focused on an emotional response and seeing the world in a new light, it doesn't have to detract from the story all too much. Something as simple as brief changes in responding to a situation, like saving a platoon of Marines instead of destroying a Covenant vessel, could speak volumes on how the Spartan program is perceived. Alright, that was a mouthful. Let's move on to... Come on, man. Yep, I fucked this one up too. It's a giant red flag as soon as you see this. I don't entirely blame the writers or showrunners for this one, since the first time we see the Halo universe is in 2552, starting right off with the Pillar of Autumn approaching the Halo ring, which is known as Installation 04. However, with Halo Combat Evolved, it gives enough visual context to understand what kind of position humanity is in. The show not only wants to take place in 2552, but it also wants to showcase an internal UNSC struggle, along with the insurrection movement, the growing strength of the Covenant looming over them, and the eventual discovery of the Halo installations, all happening in 2552. For those who don't know, in Halo lore, by the time of the first game, the Human Covenant War has been going on for 27 years. The conflict in question is one that involves the extermination of billions of people, colonies being wiped out and burned to ash. The important thing to remember is that the Human Covenant War isn't just a war, it's a genocide where humanity doesn't stand a chance. Even a game like Halo Combat Evolved, where most of it takes place on the ring, there's at least 6 Covenant battlecruisers. They always outnumber the player and whatever allies get scrounged up. Not only that, but the start of Halo 1 involves the Pillar of Autumn retreating from easily the worst part of the war and just narrowly escaping destruction. And even by the end, when the Flood have taken control of most of the ring and Chief is likely the last human left, the Covenant Armada is always there. There's one part of the show when the UNSC headquarters gets shown a feed of a colony that gets glassed, but there's no weight to it. It's on a planet that's never been seen or mentioned prior, and there's not even any ships or anything to show what kind of situation it is. It's just a burnt up city and everyone's sad because the Covenant did something bad. The only time the Covenant feel like a powerful foe that was as deadly as they should was in the first episode. After that, they just kinda exist and use their human goon to do everything, which I guess I'll talk about for a second. So this show did something I've personally never seen in a Halo property, which is give the Covenant a human character to follow around. Now, the idea of the Covenant working with a human isn't unheard of. In the Spartan Ops portion of Halo 4, there's a bit where Dr. Halsey escapes her custody from the UNSC and works with Joel Mudana in order to uncover more Forerunner stuff. Though again, this is after the war has ended. The character's name is Meki. She's one of the 2 people linked to the plot MacGuffin, simply called the Artifacts, the other being John 117. And luckily for the Covenant, when they pick her up as a child, she hates humanity like the rest of them. I thought it was kind of weird this religious armada that's very much non-discriminatory and wiping out humans just lets this lady hang out with them, but it's eventually revealed that once the Great Journey begins, she'll have her purpose and the Prophets are going to kill her like all the... Hey, this sounds familiar. I feel like if they just started in 2525 when the Human Covenant War actually starts, and where there might be some doubts on whether or not it's just UNSC propaganda to end the insurrection movement, while members of the Spartan program begin to have doubts on their purpose, would fit right in the spot. There could also be a great use of less is more. With a war that early, the Covenant can be seen as an unpredictable threat with very little known information to the UNSC. An endless armada that has no desire to spare humanity, killing without discretion while only one line of defense remains. Not only that, but if this show wanted to have a John 117 that's questioning Halsey's motives or how he ended up in the Spartan program, he would feel far more appropriate in this part of the Halo timeline. That way, over time, you can slowly build up to the cool-headed, badass Master Chief that we all know and love, watching the human side of him grow into a strength as the war escalates. Then, as this goes on, you slowly introduce Forerunner tech, then flash forward some years later, it's the Halo ring! Yay! Back in 2010, when Halo Reach was almost out, Microsoft and Bungie put out an ad called Deliver Hope. It's just a 60-second commercial that has a 2-minute extended cut, but this live-action visual representation completely nails the feeling and atmosphere that Halo Reach's story set out to accomplish. It's bleak, hopeless, and represents humanity on the brink of extinction. This is a commercial designed to sell video games, and yet I feel so much more connected to everything in this ad than a $200 million 7-hour adaptation. Halo 2022 is not a show meant for Halo fans. I really don't like saying that, but it's very clear the show's target audience was people who had a faint idea on what Halo was. They look it up and see it's a video game with that one green dude they saw a cardboard cutout at a GameStop. If you enjoy the Halo show, I got nothing against you. There are action pieces that I could see a lot of people enjoying, beefed up with modern special effects that give you a rush of excitement. It's just one of those things where I'm absolutely sure it could be better, despite what others might lead you to believe. However, there is one important thing. If you're gonna take away one thing from this video, just know, it's nowhere near as bad as Halo Nightfall.